For those who don't know me, I'm Daniel Schindler. I'm a faculty member here in SAFS, and I just wanted to take the opportunity to welcome all the visiting potential graduate students. We pulled in a hot speaker for you today to give some indication of what we have to offer. Today is the third speaker we've had to talk about issues of allocation. The last two were pretty hardcore economists talking most specifically about red snapper fisheries in the Gulf of Mexico. We thought we'd pull someone else in who could talk about a more local issue, and today's speaker, Jim Martin, is going to talk about allocation conflicts on the Columbia River out here in the Pacific Northwest. Jim is known to lots of people in the audience, but to those who don't know him, I will give a brief overview. Jim Martin is currently the Conservation Director, and he's advocate for the Berkley Conservation Institute, which is a branch of Pure Fishing, which, if you don't know it, is the largest tackle company in the world. This is not why Jim is known. Jim is known after a very illustrious career for 30 years with the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, where he told us this morning about all the different roles he played with the agency, but ended up as Chief of Fisheries for 6 years, and during that 6 years, or maybe an additional 3 years, he was an advisor to the governor of Oregon on salmon. He has a really long CV and lots of awards, so I'm only going to pick on one, and that apparently is in 2005, he was inducted into the National Freshwater Fishing Hall of Fame. I have no clue how you get in the Hall of Fame for fishing, but apparently he qualifies. Anyhow, today Jim Martin is going to do something very bold, and he's going to leave PowerPoint at home, and which is a big experiment, but anyhow, I've seen Jim talk before, and I'm sure it'll be fine. So with that, Jim Martin.
Thanks, Dan. And, thank you all for being here. I appreciate the honor of being invited.
Oh, shit.
This is such an interesting topic. Yeah, screen. Such an interesting topic, and we could talk narrowly about the issue of sport commercial allocation within the Columbia River fisheries, and I want to make it real clear we're talking about non-Indian fisheries, not Indian fisheries. So the fisheries below Bonneville Dam. We could talk very narrowly about that, or we could talk much more broadly about this is a case example of essentially getting ready for conflict. Now, I've been a professional fish and wildlife biologist for 45 years. And when I got into this business, basically I thought it was all about technical management, all about stock recruitment curves, all about developing sustainable fisheries models. I thought it was all about protecting the habitat. And what I came to see is it's all about managing conflict. That the process of fisheries management is heavily dominated by conflict in every stage, and you either go looking for conflict by trying to anticipate the things that need to change, or conflict will come find you. And what I found when I was a young biologist at Oregon State University is I wasn't very well trained in that. I was trained in technical management, but I wasn't trained in the communication skills, the collaboration skills, the advocacy skills that are going to be required. So I'm going to start out talking a little bit about history, because I don't believe you can really delve into any fisheries management issue in the here and now today without understanding its historical trajectory and why this conflict has come to us now and what drove this conflict in this direction, and then where we're going to go from here. I'm going to end up talking a little bit about the criteria by which I think allocation decisions should be considered in general, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how to prepare for a career full of conflict for you. Now, there may well be some of you who are able to sconce yourself in the laboratory somewhere, or maybe do very, very esoteric stock assessment that somebody else gets to interpret into the room of the conflict. But for most of you who are going to go to work for NGOs or for agencies or for academia, conflict will find you. And I want to encourage you to embrace that, because in a political democracy, this is how we make change. I mean, I suppose there's a few of us who want to be decision makers on relatively innocuous things like when the deer season opens. Well, you'll get to make those decisions in Fish and Wildlife agencies, and you won't get much conflict about it. But frankly, it doesn't matter. The much more important role for the professional is by being a trusted advisor to the political system. And all the big decisions are political decisions, and all the big decisions will be made by political leaders. And the best that we can hope for in this career is to be a trusted advisor and know how to boil down the scientific aspects of that will be considered, hopefully be considered, along with a whole lot of economic and political and other kinds of advocacy advice that political decision makers have to consider in making critical decisions. I spent a very enlightening 3 years working in the governor's office just as I was ready to finish up my career working for the state of Oregon. I got to see kind of how the sausage gets made and just how all of this mixes together in terms of political decisions to either make change or sit on the status quo for a little longer. And so I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the evolution of fisheries in the Columbia River. I want to make it real clear I'm not representing any state agency. I'm just speaking for myself and my experience in 45 years of business, being pretty familiar with this issue. I'd like to talk a little bit about the trajectory of how we got here. I'd like to talk to you a little bit about what Oregon and Washington Departments of Fish and Wildlife, the commissions, have decided as a strategy for change. I'd like to talk to you about the kind of concepts, the general conceptual framework for that change. I'd like to talk to you a little bit about some of the interim results summarized by both agencies. I just picked it up off their sites in the last year, in 2014, and where I think we're going to go over the next couple of years, where I think we're going to end up going over the longer term. If you think about Columbia Fisheries, you can think about back in the late 1800s when there were between 11 and 16 million wild fish, 11 and 16 million wild salmon and steelhead moving up and down the Columbia River, best estimates. Think about the magnificence, 11 to 16 million wild fish. And major fisheries developed in the Columbia. Of course, they're historical from a tribal perspective, but the non-Indian fisheries really developed in the second half of the 1800s and involved largely commercial fisheries and the canning industry, and the bringing of Scandinavian fishermen who brought gillnet technology from Scandinavia and settled in the Lower Columbia, began exploiting some of those 11 to 16 million fish. And there was a time when Astoria was just absolutely lined gunnel to gunnel with canning, and it was big business, big industrial fisheries business. In addition to the gillnet fisheries, there were fish wheels, there were traps, and if you go to the Lower Columbia today, you can see a lot of the old pilings out in the estuary, still from the historical traps that used to be used as traps. There were beach seines, there were lots of different kinds of gear to exploit these fisheries. By 1910, these fisheries had maxed out, and it was generally accepted that we were beginning to see the decline from overfishing of the Columbia River runs. By 1930, it was clear there was trouble. We not only were hitting the fish very, very hard from a fisheries perspective, but small dams had been established throughout the entire Columbia Basin, and large dams were beginning to build. And in the 1930s, Bonneville Dam was built, and Grand Coulee Dam was built, followed by literally dozens of other large-scale dams on the tributaries and the main stem of the Columbia and the Snake. And the writing was on the wall for a lot of the salmon populations, and it was getting tighter and tighter, the conflict, even amongst dominantly the commercial fisheries at that time. The first major allocation fight came in the 1930s when the gillnetters had it out with the trap and seine and fish wheel operators, and through initiative petition essentially banned them. So the gillnetters won that battle, and the fish wheel operators and the seine, the trap guys lost, and they were banned by state law. And so things continued largely that way through the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s. until you got the really substantial emergence of the sport fisheries starting to exploit significant numbers of salmon. And then for about a 30-year period of time, the spring Chinook and the summer Chinook fisheries were closed down during the summer period because it was clear that wild spring and summer Chinook were in real trouble, and the only harvestability of those fish was in tributaries where they would separate themselves out from hatchery fish. Now, during all this time, hatchery production was expanding dramatically. So today we're looking at maybe, instead of 11 to 16 million fish, maybe a couple million fish on average, and a very substantial portion of those are hatchery fish. Between steelhead, summer and winter steelhead, spring and fall Chinook, summer Chinook, early coho, late coho, a few chum that are largely wild. So the net effect is we've dramatically reduced the overall volume and production of salmon in the Columbia River, mostly because of not so much of overharvest, but because of habitat destruction, particularly large-scale storage dams that blocked off big chunks of the Canadian Columbia River and others. And that has led to a couple of things that I would say changed the nature of fisheries management in the Columbia in a really important and constraining way. In the 1960s, we had the emergence of the tribes as full-scale co-managers. They were no longer considered another interest group, another user group. They were recognized all the way to the Supreme Court as full-scale co-managers, and the Bolton-Baloney decisions were characterized in U.S. versus Washington versus Oregon. U.S. versus Oregon was the one that really affected the Columbia River the most, and clearly outlined not only the role of the tribes as full-scale co-managers, but as deserving of a full 50% share of the harvestable surplus, or some deviation from that they might agree to. But in the absence of agreement, a full share. So you can imagine what that meant for fisheries that were going to prior and accept fish that were headed over Bonneville Dam into the tribe's usual and custom area. It meant a huge restriction on what had occurred in ocean fisheries and Lower Columbia River fisheries prior to that. The second thing that came along in the 1980s and 90s was the restrictions of the Endangered Species Act. Snake River salmon were the first ones to be listed, but eventually we ended up with 13 individual groups that were listed under the Endangered Species Act. And now you had a new role of the federal co-managers establishing the cap for harvest in the Columbia River, that no matter how many hatchery fish there were, you couldn't have more than a fixed impact on each of the runs of fish, all the way from sockeye, spring Chinook, summer steelhead, winter steelhead. All of them ended up listed wild populations, and each one has an individual impacts cap. Now the combination of the impacts cap of the Endangered Species Act and the need to properly allocate the tribal destined fish that are going to move through the general fisheries in the ocean and the Columbia River basically hugely constrained the ability to have high-powered sport and commercial fisheries below Bonneville Dam. It was a sea change in terms of the availability of the fish. Now in 1958, gill netting was banned in the coastal streams of Oregon on the thought that there just wasn't enough fish, there just wasn't a powerful enough volume of fish to allow both commercial gill netting and sport fishing when you'd already had a really important sport and commercial ocean fishery in front of that. There just wasn't enough room for an in-river gill net fishery in the Oregon coast. They did not ban gill netting in the Columbia River, and the thought was, well, that's a place where we still have large-scale opportunity for industrial commercial fisheries, and so they remained available in the Columbia River for gill netting. Okay, now that leads then to the 1980s and the 1990s, when we began to see that there was an opportunity to reopen some of those Columbia River fisheries, which had been closed for over 30 years, because we started to do mass marking of hatchery fish with an adipose clip so that you could actually see what fish you caught, either in a gill net or in a and a sport gear and be able to identify the difference between hatchery fish and wild fish. So because of marked select fishing, where you could release the wild fish, keep the hatchery fish, we began to reopen fisheries that had been closed for 30 years for spring Chinook and summer Chinook in the main stem Columbia. And the rules of the road at that time, established by the two commissions, was generally speaking about a 50-50 allocation of the allowable Endangered Species Act impacts between non-Indian commercial fishermen and sport fishermen. Okay, so 50% of those impacts were going to go to management of the thousands of sport fishermen, and 50% of those impacts were going to be reserved for roughly 200 gillnetters to supply the market. And that was the Commission's vision of what a good balance was at that time. Now fast forward another decade, and sports fishermen were very unhappy with that allocation. And what they were arguing is we're leaving a lot of economic benefit on the table. Let me give you an example with spring Chinook. In general, sport fishing in the Columbia River, it takes somewhere around 6 to 8 days of fishing to catch one fish. I mean, it's amazing the sportsman will actually fish that hard to catch one fish. And as a general, because they're so valuable, they're such a high quality sport and eating fish. And in general, sportsmen pay somewhere between $50 and $100 per trip in direct expenditures, not counting buying boats and stuff like that. So we're talking about $400 to $800 per fish of economic value in direct expenditures. Now contrast that to the other 50% of the allowable impacts are going to go through gill netting, where a gill netted fish is going to sell from $50 to $100. So as the seasons became more and more and more and more constrained, sportsmen began advocating we've got the wrong balance here. Not so much for fall fish, which are far more abundant, fall Chinook and coho, but particularly for summer Chinook and for spring Chinook that are most highly prized in the sport fishery and most economically valuable in the sport fishery, according to sport fishing advocates. And so that as those seasons got tighter and tighter and tighter and tighter, gill netters were down to fishing a couple days on relatively low spring Chinook runs, and sportsmen were down to fishing almost no time in April anymore, which is when the main run comes in. People said things have to change. Things have to change in a fundamentally dramatic way. Now, another thing that happened during this early, late 1900s, early 2000 period was the development of safe areas, select area fisheries enhancements. These are bays and sloughs, areas identified by the Departments of Fish and Wildlife, Oregon and Washington. There are 4 areas in the Lower Columbia River where fish could be placed, hatchery fish could be imprinted off channel. So the nice thing about safe areas is once those fish are imprinted there, they move through the main stem, they contribute to ocean fisheries, they contribute to estuary fisheries, and then they find their way into the bays and sloughs, pull in there and hold, and they can be gill netted at a very high rate of effectiveness, 95% or so, with relatively little of the main stem fish wandering in there. So relatively little impacts on very, very limited ESA constrained impacts. So by the late 2008, 2009, 2010, a lot of conversation was going on with both Washington and Oregon Fish and Wildlife Commissions about shouldn't we change the way these fisheries are managed to more appropriately allocate toward the better economic opportunity. And by the way, a lot of people think conservation would be better with lower bycatch and lower bycatch mortalities on endangered wild fish that are moving up the river. But the primary impetus for a lot of people was just a better economic balancing of opportunity, and particularly for spring Chinook and summer Chinook. Now, some people came up with the idea, well, maybe we could compensate the commercial fishermen to move out of the main stem by putting more hatchery fish than currently occur in the safe areas and essentially pay off the debt, the economic debt, so they'd have a long-term effective economic opportunity there, and the market would be fed as well. So that was part of the conversation. Now, in 2010, an initiative petition was begun in Oregon to essentially ban gill netting, period, in the Columbia, non-Indian gill netting, not Indian fisheries, non-Indian gill netting. And a lot of us thought, well, wait a minute, that's going to take away this very, very effective, safe opportunity where we're targeting a lot of hatchery fish into these off-channel areas, and that's a good thing. That's not a bad thing. That's not burning up many impacts. It's very, very valuable for the commercial fishery. It's very, very good for supplying fish to the market. We've got a lot of hatchery fish here in the Columbia River. Can't we figure out a way of using those safe areas to compensate for the loss of particularly spring Chinook and summer Chinook in the commercial fishery, where the economic disparity in allocation values is the greatest? So if that initiative had passed, a lot of people were worried that we would lose the opportunity to effectively manage these safe areas as well, and that would lead to a lot more straying, because when those fish turn off into those safe areas, they get harvested at about a 95% rate. Pretty darn effective in terms of lowering straying and getting value. Most of those safe areas are in the lower Columbia River, where these fish come in at ocean bright market values. It's a really good thing not to try to screw up. And so Governor Kitzhaber came forward to kind of the warring parties. Obviously, the commercial fishery was dead set against the initiative. The recreational fishery, for the large part, was in favor of the initiative. And the governor said, look, there's got to be a better way of creating a long-term commercial fishing opportunity here, and yet do appropriate reallocation, particularly for the spring and summer Chinook, but also considering the fall Chinook and the coho as well. And so he proposed an alternative strategy. And he proposed that the two commissions, the Washington and the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, and the commissions that run those departments, basically create a period of transition where we would reallocate spring Chinook and summer Chinook, fall Chinook, from the current 50-50 allocation of limiting stock impacts to something approaching 80-20. It would still leave a main stem opportunity in the Columbia River, but allocate less critically limiting Endangered Species Act impacts to it. It would also allow an expansion of the extremely economically valuable sport fisheries there, and basically there would be a couple of other provisions in his plan. One provision would be to substantially increase smolt releases of spring Chinook, fall Chinook, and coho in the safe areas to partially compensate the gill netters, and also to explore new safe areas, because right now there was only 4. Perhaps we need more room to be able to conduct commercial fisheries, and also to continue commercial fisheries in the main stem of the Columbia River, but with different gear. Rather than gillnet gear, where there was such a concern about bycatch mortality, explore the old techniques that had been banned in the 30s, like purse seining, beach seining, pound nets, trolling, trapping, fish wheels, which theoretically could catch surplus hatchery fish and also harvestable wild fish, particularly the upriver bright fall Chinook, for a viable commercial fishery. It would fit better with a revised recreational fishery and allow the sorting of hatchery fish from wild fish. Now, the reason why that's really important is because we've got a problem in the Columbia. Almost all of the wild fish, except for the upriver bright Hanford Reach fish, are listed under the Endangered Species Act, the wild component of them. So we have an obligation to try to restore, try to rebuild those wild listed fish and recover them. And part of that's going to be habitat management. Part of that's going to be harvest management. At the same time, when the dams were built, there was a tremendous hatchery mitigation program agreed to and approved. So for many stocks of fish, we've got 80% of the spring Chinook or so that are hatchery produced. Some of them are going into tribal country. A lot of them are returning to tributaries in the Lower Columbia River. We've got to figure out, if we're going to have fisheries, got to figure out a way to catch those fish. Well, the reality is the sport fishery is extremely lucrative from an economic point of view, but it's not very powerful. It's not powerful enough to catch those hatchery fish that are otherwise available for economic value. It makes sense to try to catch those fish with a supplemental commercial fishery. If you can do it in such a way you're not setting back with bycatch impacts and excessive release mortality, the rebuilding of the wild fish. So what you can see is there's a challenge with hatchery spring chinook. There's particularly a challenge with hatchery coho. There's particularly a challenge with upriver bright fish, which are mostly healthy wild fish. To be able to selectively catch those fish, there's particularly a problem with hatchery Thule fall chinook, another group of fall chinook that go primarily to the Lower Columbia River, straying excessively onto the spawning grounds. We're clearly going to have a problem in recovering these fish and getting appropriate Endangered Species Act permits unless we figure out a way to use harvest in some way, to either relocate these fish through hatchery manipulations or use harvest to be able to catch the available hatchery fish. So therefore, it didn't make sense to completely eliminate the commercial fishery from the main stem. That was not the purpose. The purpose was to develop gear that would allow sorting of those harvestable fish from those wild fish with a higher release survival. Now, my friends in the gillnet industry have looked at this whole plan that the governor had with great askance. Obviously, they have severe concerns about that. My friends in the sport industry said it probably doesn't go far enough, really question the need for these big industrial commercial fisheries in the main stem. But most people think it was the right plan, and the departments of Fish and Wildlife in Washington and Oregon and their commissions have approved that plan. So in 2000, let me get my numbers right here. 2012, the decision was made establishing a transition period from 2012 to 2016. We just completed kind of a midterm review by both the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife and the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife to kind of look at how this transition is going. Where do we see concerns? Are we delivering the fish to an effective commercial fishery? Have we seen expansion of the economics in the sport fishery? What are the critical uncertainties? How's this going to work? Right now, this is just my characterization after reading the documents of the two departments. I would say a couple of things are going pretty well. The allocations are definitely shifting. The allocations have moved from 50-50 to 70-30, for example, this year for spring chinook. I think it's 60-40 for fall chinook. I think it'll be 60-40 for summer chinook. I think it'll be 70-30 for fall chinook, and it's slated to go by 2016 to 80-20. And that has resulted in a new record in terms of angler days and economic value for main stem Columbia River fisheries, sport fisheries. I'll give you some numbers. I would say another thing that's going well is the production shifts. We're up to somewhere between 10 and 16 million fish that are now dedicated to the 4 safe areas and some exploration of the potential cleanness or mixes of upriver stocks in potential safe areas that might make them available for safe areas in the future. So that, I think, is going well. The challenge really is, are we making good progress toward developing alternative commercial fishing gears for the Columbia River that have the power to catch, 100,000 upriver brights in 20 days when they come in the Columbia River before they get into tribal country going over Bonneville Dam, which is to catch the non-Indian share that the sport fishery can't catch? Or are they going to be missed opportunity? How are the fisheries going in the safe areas? I think they're going very well. We're getting very high harvest rates, very good value out of the safe areas. The safe areas right now are providing about half of the entire commercial fishing catch in the lower Columbia River below Bonneville. So from a perspective of our safe areas providing a very viable commercial fishing opportunity, I'd say the interim result is it looks good. Now, will they continue to get expanded numbers of adults back that result from the expanded numbers of smolts back? We're still learning. We've seen increases, but have they been increased commensurate with the goals? And I think the departments are committed to making adjustments. If it turns out that crowding all the smolts in the safe areas cause reduced production, what will the production be that's necessary to fully compensate for those spring and summer Chinook reallocations? Another challenge is how do we catch the hatchery coho that are mixed in with the wild coho that are coming to lower river tributaries? Not fish that are going over Bonneville into tribal country, but those fish that are going into the Cowlitz and those fish that are going to the Willamette and the other lower river tributaries. Last year we had over 1 million fish come to the Columbia River, 1 million coho alone come to the Columbia River. That was huge. That was a really big fishery. They were well mixed hatchery and wild fish. Over half of them were hatchery fish. How do you harvest them if you have only purse seines and beach seines and traps to work with? I think the agencies are still struggling with whether that's going to end up working. And finally, we still got way too many hatchery Thule Chinook mixing with wild fish in the limited tributaries of the lower Columbia where we have the Thule strain. Now, the Thule strain of fish is particularly important from a U.S.-Canada perspective because they contribute tremendously to the important Canadian fishery of the west coast of Vancouver Island. And they are the #1 contributor to the important tribal and non-tribal fisheries of the ocean off the coast of Washington and Oregon. So Thules are very, very important, particularly for ocean contribution. And so we end up with a situation where we've done a 2014 update of how things are going, and we've got the reports of the agencies. Now I'd like to just briefly summarize some of the numbers. Oh, I should mention that there was litigation against this by the commercial fishing industry in both states. And it was essentially dismissed in Washington and is still pending in Oregon. The case, citing a number of administrative inadequacies in the way the Oregon Commission made its decision, has been heard in front of the Oregon Court of Appeals, and there's been no finding so far. So obviously, whatever that finding is will have to be dealt with if it's a positive finding for the commercial industry by the Commission. Otherwise, it's a potential threat to the entire scheme. Now, in the review that was summarized by the two agencies, I'm not going to give you precise economic numbers, but I'm going to give you ballpark economic numbers as I could interpret them and summarize them up. The sport fishery in 2014 set a new record for angler days. This was really, really good news from an economic point of view. These are extremely valuable fish, and this is a very large-scale tourist-based fishery that comes to the mouth of the Columbia River, and tourist-based visiting anglers, like those that go to Alaska and those that go to Canada, are extremely important on a per-person basis from an economic point of view, because they stay in hotels and because they eat in restaurants and because they hire guides. You end up with a tremendous economic shot in the arm for every fish caught by the visiting tourist angler. Last year we had 451,000 angler days of all species in the main stem Columbia River, not counting tributaries. And depending on whether they spend something like $50 per day or $100 per day, that equates to something like $22 to $45 million of economic importance to the lower Columbia region alone, not counting multiplier effects as that money is then spent through the economy. So you can get carried away with these multiplier effects and end up with astronomical numbers, but those are kind of like direct expenditure numbers. The commercial fish, and that was to catch about 150,000 fish in the sport fishery. The commercial fishery last year caught about 385,000 salmon. About half of those were caught in safe areas. About half of those were caught in main stem areas. A very substantial majority of those were the extremely valuable upriver bright fall chinook and the early and late hatchery coho. And so main stem fisheries still, in the Columbia River, main stem gillnet fisheries still comprise a very, very substantial portion of the overall economic picture right now. There were also some experimental level purse seine fisheries, beach seine fisheries, and some trap fisheries and things like that, but they didn't contribute very much to the overall value to the commercial fishery. But in a nutshell, commercial fishermen as of right now are doing quite well. They're catching roughly twice as many, more than twice as many fish as the sport fishermen in the main stem, and their fishery last year added up to about roughly in the order of $8.5 million of ex-vessel value, about half of which was coming from the safe areas. So my characterization of this issue right now is the jury is still out on whether it's going to play out as originally planned by 2016 when the transition period is theoretically over. I think the production changes are going well. I think the allocation shifts are going well. I think the exploration of new safe areas is going well, although it remains to be seen whether we'll end up restricted to the same ones we have now, have to deal with some crowding problems, or whether we'll have new safe areas that will actually work. I think the jury is still out on whether alternative selective gear like purse seines and beach seines and traps and trolling and other kinds of gear is capable of catching the volume of particularly the upriver bright fall chinook, which are the big commercial money fish of the Columbia, whether they'll be capable of catching the hatchery coho that will come in, which can vary from a few 100,000 to over 1 million from year to year, and whether they'll be capable of the kind of selective targeting of hatchery toolies so you can actually really weed the hatchery toolies out of those fish that are destined as spawning grounds and avoid having to cut production because of over impact on wild toolie populations. So that's my kind of general characterization of it. If you're a sportsman, you think things are going well and this is going to end up working. If you're a commercial fisherman, you're convinced that this alternative gear is never going to work out. It's just an underhanded plot to eliminate the mainstream commercial fishery. There's only so many people and so many fish you can stick in safe areas, and we're going to be entirely dependent on hatchery fish and lose our historical share of wild fish, and we're going to end up getting shafted over this thing. So the conflict continues, and my assessment is the jury is still out on how this is going to play out. By 2016, if we don't have alternative gear, then some other decisions are going to have to be made about whether we're going to forego that commercial harvest or whether we're going to reinstitute strategic and selective use of large mesh gillnet fishing for upriver bright fish and probably tangle net, tooth net fishing for coho. Tooth net fishing is where you use a small enough mesh that the coho get their teeth tangled up and they don't suffer so much mortality with the gills getting caught up in the net, and you can pull them in, you can select out the hatchery fish, release the wild fish with acceptable harvest or release mortality rates. So in a nutshell, that's a summary of the history of how we got here. That's a summary of what the concept is. That's a summary of who supports it and who doesn't. That's a summary of what the agencies have summarized as the catch and economic values that are occurring right now in the Columbia as of 2014. And that's a little bit of my personal projection as to what the critical uncertainties are by 2016 as to whether this plan can move forward as anticipated and as anticipated by the commissions, or whether some fallback decision is going to be required in 2016, 2017. Now, I'd like to take a moment to just talk about allocation in general. Whether we're talking about red snapper in the Gulf, whether we're talking about the ocean reallocation that happened of coho from moving, when I was chief of fisheries, we did a major reallocation in the ocean, going from the majority of the coho being caught by commercial fisheries to the majority of the coho being caught by recreational fisheries, and there was a lot of conflict over that. We've had minor reallocations of halibut, we've had minor reallocations of a number of species. In 1965, by initiative, steelhead were reallocated entirely to recreational fisheries, and gill netting was disallowed of them. I think reallocations are inevitable as things change, as the population of people grows, as the setting for management grows. You're always going to have a desire to try to get the best bang for the buck for the limited number of fish, the most value for the most people at a local, a regional, and a national scale. You're always going to try to get the most jobs created. You're always going to try to get the very best conservation benefits with the least damage to either habitat or bycatch populations and weak stocks. The problem is right now in this country, we don't really have a conceptual framework for allocation. What we got's a food fight. So every time you open up the question of allocation, you end up with this hair-pulling, eye-gouging effort like we have right now, where people who are pushing change essentially push as hard as they possibly can. People who are resisting change resist as hard as they possibly can, and the rest of the public goes, what the hell's going on? What does this really mean? Now here's what I think we should have. I think we should try to quit avoiding this problem and embrace this problem and create a policy framework that allows us to really inform a transparent and open decision based on what the best public use of the fish is. Right now, everybody kind of drags in their economics. And I'll bet you, when you heard the story about red snapper, you heard violently different pictures of the economics. We heard violently different pictures of the value and the economics as we were going through the commission deliberation process on this Columbia River harvest reform process I was just talking about. Everybody's got their own value. Everybody's got their own favorite economist. Everybody's got their idea of what the most valuable fish are and what the best use is and who has the most jobs. And essentially it would be like the commission just inviting all the interest groups to present their own stock assessment. What's their opinion about how many fish are out there? We don't do that. We ask the professional staff to present the stock assessment. Then we ask the fishermen to give us advice on what the best use of the fish is. Well, that's what we lack as an allocation policy framework in this country. We've got allocations all over the country that are based on pre-Magnuson sharing between sport and commercial fisheries and marine fisheries that are 30 to 40 years old. And so in the absence of making an overt decision about what the best use of the fish is from an economic perspective and jobs and a conservation perspective, we just default to those old sharing arrangements. We had big, powerful commercial fisheries in the ocean before Magnuson constraints, and how many sportsmen were able to access those fish at that time. And we still have built into fisheries management plans in this country for many, many, many marine species allocations that are literally based on that old of sharing. And yet the economic picture has changed dramatically in 40 years. But what we lack is a policy framework to systematically look at allocations on a regular basis and say, are these still relevant? Are these still the best use of the fish? Or should they have been long ago looked at, and should they be looked at now? That debate is currently happening in Washington, D.C. as we look at the reauthorization of Magnuson. As you might imagine, sportsmen think it's a good idea to have a policy framework and re-examine allocations in marine fisheries where sport and commercial fisheries share on a very regular basis. And commercial fishermen think that's a mistake. It creates uncertainty. We can't possibly get loans on our boat. Nobody will know what their allocation is in the future. Can't possibly do this. No way, no how over our dead bodies. So here's what I think we should consider Now, some people just think the only relevant consideration is economics. I disagree. I think there are many things that should be looked at from a socioeconomic and a biological point of view. But here would be my personal checklist. If I were setting up a policy, it would be to re-examine mixed sector fisheries in this country every 5 years and say, is the system working relatively well? Or based on a relatively preliminary analysis, are we leaving big time economics and jobs on the table that a sliding scale reallocation would accomplish? And if the answer is yes, then proceed into a full scale, detailed, lengthy allocation analysis. I would anticipate that 90% of the time, most fishery management councils, and I was on the PFMC for 8 years, would say, no, things are working relatively well. But occasionally they would say, it's been 20 years since we examined this. We should make an overt policy decision where everybody can see the economics and jobs, the conservation considerations, the other considerations, the socioeconomic considerations, and look at this and make another transparent public policy decision. So what are the things I think should be considered? Certainly economics should be considered. The value in local communities, regional communities, and to the nation as a whole per pound of fish allocated either through a commercial fishery or a sport fishery should be looked at. It's important. It's addressed specifically in the Magnuson Act as one of the things that should be analyzed on a regular basis. And the councils around the country actually estimate the value of commercial fisheries and sport fisheries, but they never compare the two in an allocation framework. Another consideration should be conservation. How impactful are these various fisheries on conservation considerations like bycatch rates, and handling mortalities? Would it make a difference in associated non-target fisheries if we allocated more to sport fisheries or more to commercial fisheries or changed the gear? I think that deserves a regular basis. I think another thing that needs to be analyzed is substitutions. If we're going to take fish from a commercial fishery and give to a sport fishery, what will the commercial fishery probably do? Will it substitute other species? Will it substitute other opportunities? Will it just be out of luck? Does it need to be compensated? No, the increased production in the safe areas in the Columbia River is an effort by the two states to try to compensate for the reallocated fish, particularly in spring Chinook and summer Chinook. Will it be effective enough? The jury's still out. But there's an effort, and I think compensation for reallocation is an important consideration. Things like buyouts, things like buybacks, those kind of things, making available other fish or other economic opportunities, or making fish available for commercial fisheries in places that they haven't been before. Those are options that should be examined. The social impacts for local, regional, and national communities. A lot of times, from a regional perspective, you could say society would be better off reallocating to a sport fishery, but what does that really mean to Newport, Oregon? What does that really mean to Astoria? What does it really mean to key communities? That needs to be looked at. And we shouldn't just rely on fishermen to bring their points of view to bear. We should be doing objective socioeconomic analysis. And we need to pry open that whole wing of expertise to help inform who the winners would be and who the losers would be in any allocation framework. And then finally, it's one thing to reallocate across a sliding scale, to go from 50-50 allocation to 80-20 allocation. It's another thing to go from 100% to zero. 100% to zero, reallocating on the far wings of the sliding scale, is essentially creating a fisheries extinction. That should be looked at very differently than reallocating from an economic perspective across the middle of the sliding scale. So I don't know of anybody who's arguing right now that there should be no non-Indian commercial fishery in the Columbia. But if that were the legitimate argument, I think then we'd be having to look at other things. Let me give you an example. One of the things that's really important is having a commercial fisherman's wharf in the local community, because so many people come there just to see it from a tourist perspective. If they never caught a single fish, they would be important to that community from a tourist perspective, because people love that experience of going to Fisherman's Wharf. Those are the kind of things that really need to be looked at in a comprehensive socioeconomic analysis of an allocation sliding scale. Now, fortunately, that's not what we're talking about in this case. We're talking about moving from 50-50 to 80-20 in general. There still would be very, very meaningful commercial fisheries in the safe area and with new gear in the main stem if the plan works out. But those are the kind of frameworks for allocation that I think are critically important. I think we need a regular review of mixed sector fisheries. I think we need a transparent public process, and I think we need a framework for professional analysis that informs that public process and informs those communities rather than the tremendous conflict we have right now. The reason we have in this country allocations in many marine mixed sector fisheries that are based on old sharing 40 years or more is because reopening allocation is such a nightmare. I mean, what manager who's very, very busy wants to open themselves up for earning a year and a half of eye gouging, hair pulling, name calling, and general legal threats and the whole rest of it? They'd much rather just sit on status quo. And in many cases, they will sit on status quo until we have a full-scale emergency. Now, many of us think there is a full-scale emergency in Lower Columbia, and that's why we're looking at this reallocation and Columbia River harvest reform in the Columbia right now. Now, before I wrap up and open it up for questions, and I think we've got until 6, so we'll have 40 minutes for questions and answers, challenges, comments, and I welcome them all. I just want to say that for those of you who are students in this institution, I taught for 8 years at Oregon State. I'm an Oregon State alum, 2 degrees. I think that our institutions are not preparing our professionals for the conflict that they're going to experience in life. I mean, my impression for a lot of students is you're getting an excellent preparation for technical management. You're learning all about modeling and stock assessment. You're learning all about habitat utilization and behavior. Learning about sophisticated genetic analysis. You're learning about the ecological transport of nutrients. You're not getting ready for the swirling political tornado. Now, when you get to be a young biologist just getting your first job, you're probably not going to immediately encounter the swirling political tornado. But as you move to mid-level supervisors and leaders in agency, you're going to encounter plenty of it. And conflict is coming. Now, conflict in the old days used to mean this kind of conflict. Conflict between fishermen, between tribal members and commercial fishermen, between sports fishermen and commercial fishermen. It used to be between gear groups, between pot fishermen and trawlers and longliners and that kind of stuff, the kind of stuff we wrestled with in the 8 years I was on the Pacific Fishery Management Council. But increasingly, that's not the kind of conflict that's going to drive you crazy. We in the Pacific Northwest are facing 2 giant change forces. When I talk about them, I usually characterize this as a great wave rising. Think about a tsunami coming your way. And at first you sit on the beach and you look out in the ocean and you think, I think there might be a wave out there. But I'm not sure. I don't know how big it is. I don't know how fast it's coming. I think more study is needed before I make any rash decisions. And the next thing you know, you look up and go, oh crap. It is here, and it is big, and now I'm absolutely sure, and I've just lost all my lead time. I've just lost my opportunity to get ready for this change that's coming. In my opinion, we have 2 waves that are coming at us. And those of you that are young professionals getting ready to come out of this institution and get ready to go work in management agencies or NGOs or tribal agencies or wherever you do, get ready for something big. The conflict of the future isn't going to be between gear groups. The conflict in the future is between those people who want to develop the habitat and those people who are going to try to protect it. The first wave that's coming at us is a wave of population. The best estimate is year 2000 census in the greater Pacific Northwest will somewhere between triple and quadruple by 2100. How many of us believe that our land use planning institutions and our political institutions are ready for that level of change. 3 to 4 times as many people. Think about the day when Seattle and Tacoma and Olympia used to be different towns, and now they just blend right together into megalopolis. Well, now quadruple that. Think about California, when it used to be San Francisco and San Mateo and Oakland were all different towns, and now it's just one big earthen swath across the Sacramento Valley. That's coming, and it's coming fast, and it's coming big. And the challenges for our energy supply, our water supply, our flood control, the challenges for our land use are going to be immense. And political leaders are going to turn to you and say, okay, we've got this growth. How do we manage it? How do we protect our wetlands? How do we protect our watersheds? How do we protect our endangered species? How do we protect our commercial and recreational and tribal fisheries? How do we keep our promises? How do we deal with the impact of that kind of a wave? Now that should cause you to just think a moment about how well you're trained to respond to the political system when it turns to you and says, okay, you professionals, what should we do? And that would be pretty daunting, pretty damn daunting. If that were the only wave, that would be bad enough. But there's a second one, and it's climate change. The reality is that climate is changing roughly 400 miles of latitude per century, which in practical terms, that means those of us who live in Portland, Oregon, by the year 2100 will essentially have the climate of Sacramento. Astoria will have the climate of San Francisco. Seattle will probably have the climate of Southern Oregon, mid-Oregon maybe. Now think about the setting at Sacramento. Think about what the landscape's like. Think about how many salmon we have in the little suburban streams of Sacramento. The answer is 0. We're rushing all around trying to save salmon in the suburban streams of Portland as if it's going to be durable. We're in for a big change. The settings in the mid to low elevations around Sacramento are all scrub oak and open landscape. The settings around Portland, Oregon at mid-low elevations are all Doug fir forests. We're in for a big change. And that change will be not incremental. That change will not be pretty. That change will be massive bug, kill, and fire. That change will be big disturbance events. And when it comes back, it'll come back in a different setting. The sea level change will not be some little incremental centimeters per decade on average. The sea level change will be mediated by big storms. Already what you can see is warm winters, exactly as is predicted by the climate models, and a hell of a lot less snowpack. More precipitation, a hell of a lot less snowpack. And yet our entire hydroelectric system is driven by the reality we'll always have this big snowpack off the Columbia. We can hold holes in our reservoirs all winter for flood control and then fill them up on the snowpack, and the salmon will still be okay, but they won't. Because most of that precipitation is going to come off in winter rains. It's not going to come off in gentle winter rains. It's going to come off in these big gully washer winter rains. And how we manage our flood control management, what the implications are for spring water supplies, what the implications are for power are gigantic. And I'm here to tell you, nobody's planning for it. Nobody's planning for a change that big. Now think about how these two waves interact. The population wave, the climate change wave are going to interact in ways you can't really guess exactly how it works. But generally speaking, we're going to take the buffer out of the system with our population development. And then when the big ecological waves hit, the system won't be very well buffered. You know, think about Katrina and the Gulf and what happened when you lost all those wetlands. We're in for a rough time. And all these decisions are going to be made from a political perspective. And the best that we can hope for as a profession is to be consulted and offered the opportunity to give good professional biological advice on which decisions will be the best for ecosystem function and ecosystem services. And maybe to keep our tribal promises for fisheries, and maybe to have a viable sport fishery, and maybe to have a productive and viable commercial fishery. That's certainly our goal. But can we deliver? Now here's what I want to challenge you with before I close up. Are you prepared for any of that? Do you even understand that that's what's coming? Do you even understand that that's what the leadership of your agencies will be challenged with? Do you think we have the structures built into our governmental systems to be able to do that forward-looking analysis, that probability analysis of those two waves hitting us, and to be able to give good ecosystem by ecosystem by ecosystem advice? I'm here to tell you we don't. I don't think it's built into our agencies. Our agencies are desperately trying to hold on to their funding base right now. And hook and billet fees still support most of our agencies. And we've got a tremendous funding crisis in every state fish and wildlife agency in this country, and they're getting close to collapse. We have to fix that, and then we have to retool our scientific expertise so that we're beginning to prepare to do job one, which is give good advice about these crises that are coming. So if I were you, and I were in this institution, I'd be wanting to look for some electives on collaboration. I'd be wanting to look for some electives on conflict communication. I'd be wanting to bring Hans and Anna-Marie Bleicher in for their informed consent training at this department. I would want to be looking at mediation philosophy and concepts. I would want to be training myself to help people deal with the conflict that's coming, and I think it goes beyond stock assessment science and basic ecology. So I'll just leave it to you to think about whether you get in the training you're going to desperately need, or whether you're going to learn it the way I learned it, which is being thrust out into the school of hard knocks and getting ground up a little bit here and there by some of these allocation fights and management fights and the change that I've experienced in 45 years. The change has been remarkable in 45 years of this business. The change in the next 45 years will be twice as remarkable. It will come faster, and it will be bigger, and it won't be fishermen fighting with fishermen. It's going to be trying to hold on to this resource in a population wave and a climate change wave, the likes of which we've never seen before. The public will need us. The question is, are we prepared? Thank you very much for having me.
Jim has talked nearly continuously since 8 o'clock this morning. But we can squeeze a few more minutes out of him.
So I'd love to have any questions or comments that you might have. Tom?
Jim, there's another well-known Jim from Oregon, Jim Licketower.
Yes.
Your description of a very manipulated system. Columbia is physically manipulated by dams, diversions, the fish populations are manipulated by hatcheries, off-site releases. Maybe you could channel Jim Licketower. What would he say in his concept of salmon without rivers? Are we going down the kind of industrial model of making fried, or would he buy into what you're suggesting?
Well, I think very certainly he would say that we're embedded in the industrial model. We're embedded in the techno fix. You know that. I mean, for those of you who have never read Jim Licketowicz's book Salmon Without Rivers, when I was meeting with the graduate students today, I recommended 4 readings. One of them was Salmon Without Rivers, and the title comes from the arrogance of people in our own profession who actually assured politicians, it's okay, we don't actually need rivers, we've got this hatchery technology, if you let us pump groundwater, we can produce plenty of hatchery, we can actually have salmon without rivers. And to me, that was a dark day of loss of ethics and loss of reality in our profession. And basically, Jim Licketowicz says, in order to understand where we have to go with salmon, you have to understand the 150-year history of trying to fix this problem and understand what went wrong, that after 150 years of salmon recovery plan after salmon recovery plan, we haven't recovered them. And now we got them listed under the Endangered Species Act. What the hell went wrong? And what he would suggest is we didn't critically assess our assumptions. For example, the assumption that we could replace salmon runs with hatchery technology, and we could maintain the conservation value of salmon with hatchery technology, and we could recreate the diversity, the biodiversity in 1,000 salmon stocks with a few hatcheries at production of scale. And he says that's just wrong, And I would have to agree with him. That was just wrong. And then the question comes down to how many of our false assumptions, untested assumptions, underlie what we're doing right now. My gillnetter friends would say there's a false assumption that you can ever have effective enough commercial fishing gear with low enough release mortalities that you would replace gillnets with them. That's going to turn out to be a false assumption. They may turn out to be right, I don't know. But those are the kind of things. I would say Jim Likatowicz would say to us, you got to back up and create an ethical and philosophical foundation for what you're trying to do. Now, to try to bring salmon conservation to a community level that people believe it in enough that they're willing to make the sacrifices. The problem is that the communities are all located downstream in the urban areas, and the great salmon production potential are all located at the end of the dam gauntlet up in the Snake River wilderness. And so there's this departure between where the money is, like Portland and Seattle and San Francisco, and Boise, and where the salmon are up in Chalice and in Salmon, in the Middle Fork of the Salmon, and those kind of places. But he's absolutely right in terms of recognizing that everything we do in conservation is the best shot, and there's no guarantees. And the size of the wave that's coming at us is astronomical, and we had better test all of our assumptions. I'll just give you a little quick example, one that's near and dear to me. When I was chief of fisheries, we revised our stock recruitment analysis for Oregon coastal natural coho, and we brought the ocean fisheries back from about 85% harvest rates to 65% harvest rates, and we desperately believed that we were doing the scientifically right thing, and we desperately held on to that model for about 10 years longer than we should, kind of ignoring science that suggested it should be actually much, much lower than that, because the ocean had shifted productivity range from when the data points that encompassed our original stock recruitment model were. Now the harvest rate of Oregon coastal natural coho is about 15% in the ocean, and the fish have rebounded dramatically, even though they're listed on the Endangered Species Act. We hung on to an outdated science model too long. We weren't adaptive enough. We didn't pick up the clues. You got to be more flexible. You got to leave the arrogance behind. You got to be more open to the fact that you might be making a mistake. You got to be ready to make a correction. So that's an example. I think that's what he would say to us. You had a question, and then you'll come next, Steve. Go ahead.
Yeah, you spoke a few times when you were talking about the allocation for the gillnet and the sport fishery about needing to have this gillnet fishery catch this fish that would otherwise be wasted. And the way you talked about it is that those fish were just, provided by God, but in fact they're provided by hatchery across the country. Talk a little bit about the economics there of what the payoff of this hatchery is.
Well, first off, let me say that the specific reference I was making in that particular case was for upriver brightfish that are headed for the Hanford Reach. And it's not like they would just be wasted. It would be like you wouldn't be able to catch the non-Indian share below Bonneville Dam. So they would probably be caught by the Indians, and it would be a bump on top of their already 300,000 or so that they catch. So it's not like they'd be wasted. It would just be, they'd be lost in economic value to the non-Indian community below. So there's a need to have a harvest tool that can capture those fish within tribal allocation constraints, and again within ESA constraints. But to answer your question more directly, as I understand the question is, well, what about the value of all these hatchery fish? How economically productive are these hatcheries? I would say it varies by species. There's some we used to do an analysis of the economic return of each of our hatchery programs in the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife when I was chief of fisheries, and we had some programs that produced spring Chinook that were so expensive to produce and had such a low ocean harvest rate and in-river harvest rate, they're so hard to catch by sportsmen that essentially, if they hadn't been mitigation fish, we wouldn't have been able to produce them. Now, mitigation fish have a whole different kind of economic role because that's like measuring the economics of greasing the turbine. You don't do that. You look at the entire power output of the entire dam. You don't just do an economic analysis of greasing the turbine. You don't just use an economic analysis of a mitigation hatchery, because if that dam hadn't been created, those fish would have been wild and free. And because that dam was created, there's an obligation, whether it's economic or not. But having said that, there are a number of hatchery programs that are much, much more economically beneficial than others. It kind of depends on what the harvest rate is. It depends on their contribution to ocean fisheries. It depends on what the sport harvest rate is, and also the sport value per fish. Like when you fish 6 or 8 days per fish, when you finally catch one, it's a pretty dang valuable fish, because you got 6 or 8 days of investment for every fish you catch. So there's no one-size-fits-all answer, but I will tell you that agencies are looking at more and more closely, because as budget cuts come, and they have to reflect some of those budget cuts in production, the key is to cut the fisheries and the production programs that are the least beneficial from an economic and jobs perspective. There's no question politically in this country, economics and jobs is the coin of the realm. When you talk to politicians, you talk about economics and jobs. And fish and wildlife biologists had better have their economics and jobs and their values in hand and ready to discuss it, because everybody who wants to develop the habitat sure as hell will have. Steve, you're next.
Yeah, first I'd like to correct you on the economic opportunity of that 100,000. The tribal fishery last year, for example, caught 250,000. Commercial fishery didn't get their 30% impact allocation to harvest their share of the zoning stocks. That's probably 50,000 one day. On top of that, we got over 300,000 upriver rights on Hanford Beach that were not needed for propagation. So it was not a transfer of economics to the tribal fishery. Just to clarify that. I guess my next, I listened to this today. I'm really sad that you and I worked for over 20 years to build runs back, coalition, fish oil, salmon, lawsuits for water flows, and now the consumer fishery is essentially being transferred, transitioned. Without that transparency that we talked about, the work of the South and all this, so to meet the objectives of recreational, commercial, and private concern, which, as you take the allocation of ESA impacts away from the commercial sector to the consumer sector, really a point of just bleeding an industry to death. And you said it in your own words. You said, don't worry about these people. They don't make enough money. You said that specifically when the two commissions were working together with you as an advisor to try to form out an allocation. Furthermore, NSIA, Northwest Sports Industry Association, that you are a member of, I believe you're the science chair, has testified to the Power Planning Council against providing funding for these select areas. You know that 20 years ago we researched additional select areas, couldn't find any that would meet the criteria needed to create meaningful harvest. They're doing it again, and they're finding the same solutions. The other point that wasn't brought up is the commercial fishery has said time and time again, we are willing to work at additional gear types in addition to gillnet fishing technology, which is very selective time area gear. So when you're going to put this commercial fishery, which provides fish for 92% of Oregon's non-fishing public, which I'm a very, as you know, I love the sport fish, so I'm not part of that 80%. When you put them into 1% of the area that they historically have fished in, how can you've got the coastal caucus, the legislature opposing this plan, you've got every chamber in the state, which is tourist-driven, opposing this plan, you've got every city, Clatsop County opposing this plan. How can you say that it's a collaborative effort with transparency that is in the best interest, both from a social-economic, both from an economic direct standpoint, such as you talk about the value of recreational fish?
Steve, let's get to the point here, because there's some other questions.
How can you take away the transparency where we're meeting objectives of the goals?
Obviously, what Steve's reflecting is some of the primary concerns of the gillnet industry, and believes and portrays that this is a kind of a behind closed door secret deal that is going to leave the commercial fishery out of luck in the future. What the commissions have said in their public comments, and I take them for their word and believe they will do and hope they will do, is make sure that that doesn't happen. Make sure that there's always a viable commercial fishery with some mainstem opportunity and some safe area opportunity. Right now, they're catching twice as many fish as the mainstem sport fishery. So I think it's pretty clear that that hasn't happened so far. The critical question, as I mentioned, is what will happen to that extremely valuable coho and upriver bright fishery when the end of the transition period happens and we're theoretically taking gillnets out of the mainstem. What will happen then if we don't have the gear to be able to substitute an adequate economic opportunity? Steve obviously believes one thing, I believe another. I trust the commissions to have made a decision and a commitment for adaptive management that they will change the strategy if it's not producing the results. And I believe we'll end up 10 years from now saying this is a huge plus for everybody. But not everybody agrees. This is an example of how people can respectfully have dramatic disagreements from a policy point of view, but be collegial about it. Other questions?
One more question. You have beer up there.
Oh my God, we're standing between us and beer? Go ahead.
Well, you can answer quickly. So if I were to try to channel our Judge Abbott, our last speaker, who was an economist, he would sort of recognize in what you're saying for your proposed allocation framework that it sort of makes sense to split between the sectors based on the sort of benefits that they're providing to society. His critique was quite different, that currently within each sector, we do a disastrous job of allocating within the sectors.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, we're really answering the wrong question. So would you extend your framework to say, we need to look within the sectors and say, cut out the shore-based anglers and give more of the fish to the guide boats so that they can charge higher rates per fish
Right.
and make more money. So does that generalize?
Well, in theory, if all you were trying to do was to optimize the economics of sport fishery, you would use some kind of strategy like that. You'd totally saturate the for hire basis first, and then you would start letting the local anglers fish because on a per trip basis, the contribution rates and the economic value, those guys don't stay in hotels and things like that as much. But that's only one consideration. You also have to consider that a lot of those local people are people who live in the state, and they pay their taxes, and they're embedded in the system, and they want to make sure they have equal opportunity. So that's why just doing a pure economic analysis, either between sectors or within sector, doesn't tell the whole story. It just informs things. I would say you need to look at lots of different characteristics, and what I'm trying to say is you need to anticipate the conflict that comes from an allocation decision and lay out a framework that allows you to look far beyond just economics, either within sector or between sectors. Okay. All right. Thank you so much.